You eventually developed a conflict between classes, the famous conflict between the plebeians and the patricians. The patricians were the upper class, and the plebeians, they were the lower class. Well, it turned out the patricians realized they needed the plebeians, particularly in wartime, because there just weren't enough patricians to go out and fight the war. Oh yes, the patricians had the horses, the plebeians generally did not, but nevertheless the numbers were not great enough to win, so they had to try to encourage the plebeians to fight for them. So they wound up giving the plebeians more rights. Actually, the book says the struggle dragged on for hundreds of years, but the plebeians eventually got the upper hand. They created a council, or two tribunes. Two tribunes came from among them. And these tribunes were able to tell the patricians, we have veto power, or if we don't like a law, we will veto it. In other words, declare your laws null and void. The plebeian tribunes could not make any laws, but they could decide we're not going to be ruled by a law that we don't like. Again, the word veto finds its way into the United States Constitution. Now, later on, in the 1800s, a man was to come along named Karl Marx who said all of history is nothing more than a struggle between classes, between the rich and poor, between the plebes and patricians, between labor and management. He was oversimplifying it, but nevertheless, he was taking part of the truth and making part of the truth the whole truth. But nevertheless, some of history is a struggle between classes, as the one class who are richer tries to dominate over a lower class who are poor, and the lower class struggles to be free. Eventually, the plebeians began to seek more and more privileges. At first, marriages between patrician and plebe was forbidden, but then as time went on, plebeians were allowed to marry patricians. Patricians married plebeians. And the class struggle became a little bit less as time went on. Theoretically, it got to where it was, at least in theory, all citizens were equal under the law, and all could try to hold political office. But in reality, a select few families wound up controlling everything. A few families got hold of the offices and held them. A few of the right club. Basically, if you wanted to get chief office in Roman times, of high office, you'd have to be born in the right family. And then you would have to make the right friendships, join the right club, and if your club fell from favor, oh my, you were out. But there was a lot of chance, potluck. You know, the club you joined had to fall into political favor, and also the club had to pick you. You might join the right club, but the club picked somebody else. So it was still a lot of matter of potluck. Nevertheless, for most people, the poor, they had little chance to succeed in getting a political office. The offices were held by a few families. So the Roman Republic, your book says, never became a democracy. Well, as I mentioned, Rome believed that they might have peace once they had control of all of Italy. But right here, across the Mediterranean in North Africa, was the city of Carthage. Carthage is in ruins today. It was located right here near this peninsula. Carthage had been founded by the Phoenicians, who had come over and thought this would be a great trading center located as part of the Mediterranean. Carthage built up a fairly large empire, in North Africa, inevitably the two systems are going to clash. Now, in the case of Rome conquering Italy, the people of Italy had worshipped the same gods, spoken the same language. Rome found it easy to assimilate them all. In the case of Carthage, folk, you have a different situation. They worshipped different gods, had a different religion, a different language, and they would not assimilate. Now, the wars that Rome fought with Carthage are called the Punic Wars. There were 3 of them. And they lasted more than 100 years. In other words, about 5 generations of Carthaginians and Romans fought each other. From the beginning, it looked bad for Carthage because Rome was a much bigger empire and had a much bigger population. But the people of Carthage had a stubborn insistence that they were not going to quit fighting. And they didn't quit fighting, in fact, until Rome finally went in, burnt their city to the ground, plowed up the ground to where it would not, plowed up the ground and put salt in the soil to where it would not grow anything anymore, and scattered the people of Carthage all over the empire. Only then did Carthage quit. It was a case of fighting people who would just keep on and keep on and keep on and wouldn't quit. All right, of the 3 wars, the first one was fought over the island of Sicily. Right here between Italy and Carthage was the island of Sicily. Carthage claimed Sicily, claimed they had it first. Rome claimed it had Sicily. They fought. And eventually Rome won. To fight, they had to build up a navy fleet, but they finally did. Carthage gave up Sicily, and Sicily became the first Roman province, or the first province outside the peninsula itself. Well, Carthage got revenge by taking over Spain, or extending its domains in Spain. In other words, we're going to get Spain. And in fact, they planned to launch an operation from Spain, get into Italy, and conquer Rome itself. So this led to the Second Punic War. First one fought over Sicily. Now, in the Second Punic War, it was to last more than 20 years. It's famous for a general who came from Carthage, a general named Hannibal. Hannibal led an army that consisted also of a bunch of elephants, led them across the Alps, the cold Alps, and got them into Italy. And for 20 years, he ravaged Italy's smaller cities. Now, Hannibal knew he could not defeat the Roman legions, but he didn't. He just simply was able to move fast as the big Roman armies were. He'd hit a small town, destroy it, then move on, hit another town, and the Roman army, excuse me, the Roman army never could catch him. Well, he did finally engage the Romans in a battle called the Battle of Cunae. Now, today's historians don't believe the figures. According to the historian of the time, Livy, I believe, or Tacitus, 70,000 were killed. But basically, here's the way it happened. The Romans lined up here. Carthage lined up here. The General Hannibal told his center, when you're fighting, just take some steps backward, pretend you're losing. So here's basically what happened. And of course, the Romans, not knowing what was happening, they, in other words, the wings were to hold while the center kept falling back. Well, the center fell back even more. And then the wings held, so the Romans found themselves, without realizing yet what happened, being encircled. Eventually, Hannibal was able to work his way around the Roman flank, and again, the Romans fought a lot like the Greeks. And once he had gotten around the Roman flank, the Romans were destroyed. It was said that Hannibal and his men took bushel baskets after battle and went through the battle collecting everything of value they could from Roman corpses. Every Roman soldier who had engaged lost his life. There was no room to retreat because, again, by thinking they were winning, the center would keep advancing and not realizing the wings were folding in on them. Well, after 20 years, a Roman general named Scipio decided, hey, he's carried the battle in our territory long enough, I'm going down to Carthage. So Scipio got his men aboard the ships and went to Carthage, and he forced Hannibal to leave Italy with his army and go to Carthage. Now, folk, I can't verify this story. I have read it. Some people would cast doubts on it, but Hannibal was really fond of an elephant charge. Well, Scipio had an idea how to handle a charge, but he told his men, now when the elephants charge at you, do what you have never done before and simply break ranks, form a pathway, and let the elephants walk right straight to the rear. And while they walk to the rear, you kill the riders. Maybe some soldier said, but sir, I've been in the army for some 20 years, I've never broke. Oh, but Scipio said, break ranks this time. I'm telling you to do so, because this time it'll work. So when the elephants charged, Roman soldiers broke ranks, formed pathways for the elephants. The elephants walked straight to the rear, but on the way to the rear, the riders were killed. Then the elephants went to the rear, and the elephant part of the battle was over. Those riders were killed. And then Hannibal had to engage the rest of the Roman troops without the aid of his elephants, who were standing riderless at the Roman rear. Hannibal could not win. He was forced to make a peace treaty. Hannibal went into exile deep into Africa in the Atlas Mountains. He eventually went around, I had a student do a paper on him, went around to Greece trying to persuade the Greeks to fight the Romans. He could not. But for him, for the most part, the fight was over. The Second Punic War ended, again in defeat for Carthage. Well, 50 more years went by. The Carthaginians would not quit. So finally, the Romans decided we've had enough of this. They went in and, as your book says, pulled the city down, destroyed it. The Romans burned, pulled down all the city's buildings. All the inhabitants were sold into slavery, men, women, and children. And Carthage then was annexed. Now again, you might wonder, why didn't the Romans treat Carthage the same way they had the other Italian states? They simply couldn't. There are some people you cannot subjugate. There are some people you cannot get to go along with your program. And there's not a lot you can do. I mean, the Romans found 3 people throughout their history whom they could not subjugate. One of them being Carthage, the other one being the Jews here in Judea, whom they wound up conquering and driving out of Judea. And the third being my ancestors, the British, who they finally gave up on because Britain was continually rebelling. And the Romans finally gave up on Britain and let the Germans have them. 3 people that the Romans never really subjugated, never placated. The rest of the population throughout this part of the world eventually became proud to be Romans, became Roman citizens, and joined the Roman Empire and began to trade and prosper under the Roman rule. These people did not. The result, the Carthaginians were sold into slavery. And Carthage was never able to rise again. Now, if you read on, you'll find that the city of Carthage was eventually rebuilt by someone, and today it's just like a small town that only has a faint hint of its former glory.